Hey there everybody, and welcome to this week's review, which is of the Vauxhall Insignia Grand Sport SRI VX line nav with the latest 1.6 litre petrol engine. When it comes to big family hatchbacks, there's always been the two big rivals, Ford and Vauxhall. For every Ford Escort, there was a Vauxhall Cavalier. For the Ford Mondeo, there was first the Vauxhall Vectra and then the Mark I Vauxhall Insignia. But always Vauxhall was just ever slightly behind Ford and always in their shadow. However, in 2015, that segment got completely thrown out of place because Skoda released the Mark III Superb, and that went straight to the top of the class. It was incredibly practical, very well priced, it drove brilliantly and was very well built. So now, with the Mark II Insignia, it shows Vauxhall's intentions, because this car is no longer going against the Ford Mondeo. They're pitting this against its Czech rival. And I've had the Vauxhall Insignia for a week to find out if it can do it. Now, I would never have said that the Mark I Insignia was an ugly car. In fact, it was quite the opposite. But it was very much a car you bought with your head rather than your heart, and didn't really give you butterflies in your stomach. Okay, VXR version aside. But you can see it's the complete opposite with the Mark II Insignia. It's lower, wider and longer, and has a very purposeful stance, especially in this SRI trim. It just looks incredibly attractive and, dare I say, very sexy. It has a very fastback look to it rather than a hatchback, and that's no bad thing. If anything, you could probably compare the Insignia to the likes of the Volkswagen Arteon and the new Peugeot 508 with that sleek low roofline. But does that mean that there's a compromise to actually how the car drives and practicality? Let's find out. So sat in the Vauxhall Insignia, the first thing you find is that you do sit pretty low in the cabin, and you've got this raised centre console. So you do find that your driving position has actually got a sporty feel to it, and it feels quite Jaguar-esque in that regard. If, however, you find these kind of designs quite claustrophobic and hemmed in, then I would recommend the Skoda Superb as a more spacious upfront alternative. I also really like the design and the use of materials that Vauxhall have used on this Insignia, and it shows they've really thought about the cabin. So we've got soft touch plastics on top of the dash and the doors here with some faux stitching. We've also got soft touch plastics on the centre section here and also on the side of the centre console. As you go a little bit lower down, however, yes, it's a little bit hard and scratchy, but you can forgive it in a car in this segment. I also like some of the design features that Vauxhall have put in here. So we've got some faux carbon fibre on the dash and also on the doors. And there's this weird line that goes from the top of the doors all the way along the top of the dashboard and onto the other side. It just makes the Insignia's cabin a bit more interesting to other cars in the segment. Practicality wise is also very good in the Insignia. We've got some huge door pockets which you can get some large bottles of water in, a couple of cup holder spaces, as well as a little area to put your key and a 12-volt socket in front of the gear lever. You've got an extra little space which is quite deep behind the gear lever, but I do recommend not using that as a cup holder, especially if you've got the 6-speed manual. And then underneath the armrest we've got some more space, 2 USB input sockets and also an AUX in socket. If you go for the wireless charging option, however, that does get taken up by a little pad there to put your phone on it. However, you do get the tie with PSA in the Insignia, and that comes in the form of the glove box space, which, although it is lovely and lined with felt, it's only half the size as it would have been if the fuse box had been moved over to this side. So that is something that's a bit cheeky and carried over from PSA, but I will forgive it, as the rest of the front cabin is actually very spacious. Infotainment wise, you do get an 8-inch touchscreen, which is nice and clear to use and pretty easy to operate whilst on the move. However, if you need to kind of navigate up and down some of the menu systems, it can be a little bit tricky as there's no dial there to help. However, you do get Apple CarPlay and Android Auto as standard, as well as DAB and also SatNav. Some of the climate control functions you do have to use the screen for, as in where you want the direction of the fans to be blowing. But apart from that, you have got some old-fashioned rotary dials, dual zone climate control, and as a option on this car, we've even got heated seats as well as ventilated seats. So that's very luxurious here in this segment. Also, in front of the steering wheel, you do get another 8-inch display, and it is mixed in with some analog dials. So initially, There's a lot of information on display, and it's a little bit hit and miss in the way it's displayed. I would like to see either a full digital display or perhaps just some old-fashioned analog dials. But you can navigate the systems using the buttons on the steering wheel, and once you get used to it, yes, you do know where most of those systems are, and it does tell you things such as your trip computer as well as what's the most economical way of driving. But yeah, that's the interior of the Vauxhall Insignia. It's very nice and pleasant here. Granted, this particular car has got a couple of optional extras on there, and you'll see them scrolling along the bottom. One of them being the leather interior, and the other being this wonderful driver's seat with electric adjustment. Sat in the back of the Insignia, it's a little bit of a mixed bag back here. So firstly, that driver's seat is set to my driving position. I'm 5'7" tall and 5'7" wide, and as you can see, I've got a really good amount of knee room. It's definitely comparable to that of the Skoda Superb. However, because of the sloping roofline, headroom is slightly compromised. I can fit in here absolutely fine, but if you are over 6 foot tall, you're definitely going to start feeling quite claustrophobic and have your head rubbing against the ceiling. And also, because of that sloping roofline, it does mean that the door frame can come down quite low, and you might bump your head getting in and out of the car. I say might, I definitely have a couple of times when filming this car. But other than that, it is actually very comfortable back here, and the interior quality is still very good. Soft touch plastics on top of the doors, and you also get that faux carbon fibre effect. The windows themselves aren't the biggest, and they don't allow a huge amount of light in, but as a positive, they are electric and they do go all the way down. So for a couple of added creature comforts, you do get heated seats in the back here. Okay, it is an optional extra, but you also get 2 USB charging ports, and they are standard on this trim level. So it does mean 2 kids in the back here wanting to charge their mobile phones, they're not going to be squabbling and fighting over them. You also get some nice touches as well. So we have got a centre armrest with a couple of cup holders, and also the Isofix supports have got these nice little hinges on them, so it makes it really easy when fitting a child seat, and you're not going to lose the caps like you would do on something like a Skoda Superb. It's actually not too bad in here. I just wish there was a little bit more headroom so it could be more comparable to that of the Skoda Superb, but as a result, because of that kind of fastback design, it is more comparable to something like the Peugeot 508 or the new Volkswagen Arteon. But I can see myself definitely sitting in the back here and being very comfortable over a long journey. And let's now have a little look at the boot and just see what it's like practicality wise. Now at the back of the Insignia Grand Sport, you're probably thinking, Dave, how do I get that boot open? There's no handles with buttons attached, and there's no way I can get my fingers underneath that boot lid. Well, what you have to do is poke the griffin. Now I know that sounds like a very weird innuendo, but once you do, you're greeted with 490 litres of space, which is by no means class leading, especially against the likes of the Skoda Superb. But it's a really usable space. It's nice and square with the aperture, and it is actually quite shallow, so just be careful if you need to load larger items into the car. That boot lid is not going to come down and possibly break under it. You have got some tethering hooks, which are always very good, but I was surprised to see no 12-volt socket. But as a nice added feature, if you do need to get the rear seats down, you can do electrically at the press of a button. And what you have got is a 40-40-20 split with the seats, and you can actually lower the middle seat down just using a little tethering pulley on the top of the seat. So it does mean loading longer items through the Insignia Grand Sport is possible. But it is a nice usable space. Granted, it's not a completely flat floor, but again, because of that shallow roof line coming down the back, just be wary if you are loading larger items into the car. So it is a pretty practical car, but it's just behind some of the class leaders. But now that's the practicality side of the Insignia Grand Sport done. Let's take it for a drive. So once you get driving in the Insignia Grand Sport, first impressions are very good. It's an incredibly comfortable car to sit in and a very comfortable car to drive in. You can tell deep down that this is a car that's been designed to be driving on the M1 and the M25 with a sales rep sat in the driver's seat and all of his product he's trying to sell in the boot. That's clearly what the intention of the car was, but I love the way how Vauxhall have gone about it. It's very different to its predecessor, and it's got a more aggressive look and stance to it as an overall car. I know Vauxhall are going to sell an absolute shed load of this new Insignia, but it's nice to know that you could buy this as a private buyer and not feel you've just got yourself another kind of fleetmobile in that respect. Now, although the Insignia has been out for a short while, the reason I've got this particular car is because of the engine. It's the latest addition to the range. It's a 1.6 litre 4-cylinder turbocharged unit producing 197 brake horsepower, which means you've got a 0 to 60 time of around 7.5 seconds, so it is quite nippy. Now, you're probably thinking a 1.6 litre petrol with around 200 brake. That does sound quite familiar, and it sounds a bit like a PSA engine, and you'd be right. And if it also sounds familiar, it's because I've also driven an engine very similar to it with 180 brake horsepower in the Peugeot 3008, and you can click up in the top right hand corner for my review of it. And I do really like the 1.6 unit. It feels very versatile, it's quite torquey, and it's got a good response to it. And the fact that you can get versions of that engine with 280 brake horsepower, or just shy of, in the 308 GTI, just goes to show just how much of a versatile engine it is. But it suits the Insignia very well. However, if you are thinking about having this as more of a fleetmobile and doing a lot of motorway miles, then it's not the engine for you. I definitely recommend one of the diesels. As I mentioned earlier, one of the first things you notice about the Insignia is just how well it rides. It is incredibly comfortable, and even at motorway speeds, it's a brilliant long-range cruiser. But what happens if you're not on the motorway and you're just driving about on regular roads? Well, with this particular trim, and because you've got those 20-inch alloy wheels, it does mean that the bumps and imperfections on the road are amplified, and they do intrude into the cabin. There's a little bit of additional road noise as well because of those larger rims, but thankfully these lovely wing mirrors actually don't give off hardly any wind noise, so it does mean that the comfort levels are still there. But there is a bonus when you go for this SRI VX Line nav trim, and that's because you get adaptive dampers. So down on the dashboard you have got, on the center console I should say, two buttons. One says Sport and the other one says Tour, or as I would like to rename it, Super Mega Relaxing Mode. And when you put it into Sport, well, it does exactly everything you'd expect it to do. The steering gets heavier, the suspension does get firmer, and there is a bit more responsiveness to the engine. It's not the most pleasant of settings when you put it in sport mode, and it's probably going to be used more as a gimmick than anything else. However, when you do put it into Tour, that's when the complete opposite happens. Now, the steering is already pretty light on the Insignia, and it doesn't get any lighter, it stays the same. But the ride just softens, the dampers just get softer, and it deals with those bumps and imperfections even better than before. You kind of forget that you got 20-inch alloy wheels, and I could say actually you could leave it in Tour mode all the time, because if you go around any of the corners, although it does soften up the suspension and the dampers, it doesn't roll from left to right in a kind of yacht in a thunderstorm type way. If anything, the only major difference you feel is when you go over any sleeping policeman, and it's more of a front and to back rocking motion you get from it, and it just takes a little bit of extra time to adjust itself and settle itself back down. That's really the only drawback if you have it in Tour mode. Steering in the Insignia is another highlight. The steering is very light and doesn't have as much feel as other cars in its class, but when it comes to parking and low speed manoeuvring, it's an absolute doddle to manoeuvre the Insignia. In fact, you can just whip it around in one hand. Added bonus is you do get front and rear sensors as standard, although this car has also got a reversing camera, and the resolution is actually pretty decent as well. I was very much impressed. As an overall package, it just rides and handles incredibly well, the Insignia, and the way it deals with those bumps and imperfections, particularly when you've got it in Tour mode, is a huge testament to the engineering guys over at Vauxhall. They've really thought about how they wanted the Insignia to compete with its rivals, particularly cars like the Superb, which do drive incredibly well and again are brilliant long-range cruisers. But when it comes to not being on the motorway and just driving around on A roads and B roads, I think I could say actually the Insignia might have the Superb beaten on the handling stakes. just for the way it feels when you go around the corners, because of the fact I think the Insignia is a little bit lighter than the Superb as well. So well done Vauxhall for that part. The brakes on the Insignia are actually really good. There's a nice amount of feel through the pedal and they're not too sensitive or too grabby. The gearbox, I would say, is probably the weak link with the Insignia. It's a 6-speed single clutch auto, and for the most part 90% of the time it'll do you absolutely fine. It's nice and relaxing to drive to, it's nice and responsive as you go along in normal mode, but if you need to put your foot down and quickly overtake, there is a slight hesitation there. It's not quite as quick as some of the dual clutch systems out there. But also, if you put it into manual mode, you'll definitely see some of the drawbacks, particularly if you use the flappy paddles on the back of the steering wheel. It just feels way too slow for the type of car it is, and I just expected a little bit of a quicker response from it. So what are my final thoughts on the Vauxhall Insignia Grand Sport SRI VX Line nav with the 1.6 litre engine? Well, long title aside, it is a huge step forward from the Mark 1 Insignia. Quality has taken a huge step up. The way it drives and feels has also taken a major step forward. And whereas the Mark 1 Insignia was a car you bought with your head rather than your heart, especially if you do a lot of motorway driving, with the Mark 2 it's the other way round. Yes, if you've got this 1.6 litre petrol, I wouldn't recommend doing lots of motorway miles. Definitely go for one of the diesels. If, however, you're not doing lots of motorway miles and you want a nice family car that is pretty practical but not the most practical in its class and has very good performance and reasonable economy, actually no, pretty good economy for the type of engine you've got, you actually can't go wrong. Ride and handling is absolutely brilliant, and if you are on the lookout for a car in this segment, you have to consider or even shortlist the Insignia. Yes, the Superb has got it beaten when it comes to practicality, but I kind of think the Insignia is the better car to drive. I am really impressed with it, even with those 20-inch alloy wheels. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on the Insignia. It's a huge step forward, and it makes it now an incredibly competitive class to deal with. So if you are on the lookout for a car in this segment, you've definitely got to consider the Insignia. At least take a test drive. So everyone, I hope you've enjoyed my review of the Vauxhall Insignia Grand Sport SRI VX Line nav. I knew I'd get another one of those in there. If you have any questions about the car or my time with it, please put them down in the comments section below. Please don't forget to like, hit that subscribe button, and also that bell notifications icon to let you know when I, Dave the Auto Bear, bring out a new video. I'm also on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter, so please follow on there as well for additional content, including lots of still images as well as the odd live video. But yeah, guys, again, any questions or queries about the Insignia or anything else for that matter, please put it down in the comment section below. But yeah, have yourselves all a wonderful day, and I'm going to catch you all in the next video. Take care.